Hello, my name is Ammaarah Patel. I'm from York Memorial Collegiate Institute in Toronto, and this is my entry for the Road to Vimy Ridge Scholarship. The question I'll be answering in this video is, did the Treaty of Versailles influence the Second World War? The particular prompt for this was, some scholars feel that the Treaty of Versailles ensured that there would be a Second World War. With what evidence do they make that argument, and how valid do you believe their reasoning to be? So to answer this question, I split my answer up into three parts. Part 1 being the end of World War I, Part 2 being the terms of the treaty and its effects, and Part 3 being the validity of opinion. So Part 1, the end of World War I, creation of the Treaty of Versailles. To be of use, a peace treaty must be such that either the consequences are served without malice, or are served to cripple the group at fault to the point of no possible self-repair. After World War I, when one of the most globally influential treaties in human history was signed, these two opposing factors were, in my opinion, not taken with sufficient heed. At the end of the Great War, after 4 years of widespread destruction, the Central Allied powers were left with their economies and militaries exhausted and even more politically uncertain. As the victorious leaders met in Paris in 1919 to discuss rebuilding, it was made clear that the Americans, French, Italian, and British did not share the same opinions with one another. Clemenceau of France was seeking revenge for his country's past losses, such as the Franco-Prussian War. He wished to make sure Germany would never start war again. On the other hand, Woodward Wilson of the United States wanted the treaty to be based on his 14-point plan, which proposed a collective responsibility for the war and was intended to bring continental peace. In between, Lloyd George of England personally agreed with Wilson, but took into account that his people supported the wishes of Clemenceau, and so he often compromised between the two opinions. This disalignment left just the right holes in the treaty for Germany to grip, and they pulled themselves back up in the preceding years. On to Part 2, the terms of the treaty and its effects. So there are 4 main clauses of the treaty that are said to be the main factors that allowed Hitler to lead Germany into the Second World War. The 4 factors are the War Guilt Clause, reparations, disarmament, and territorial losses. The War Guilt Clause of the treaty called for Germany to accept full responsibility for World War I. The sense of isolation from blame and being targeted created resentment in Germans of the Allies. Hitler later drew on this resentment, and it can be said that this clause turned Germans away from the Allies and towards war. The second factor is reparations. As the War Guilt Clause outlined, Germany was expected to take full blame for the war. This included responsibility of the costs associated with each and every battle. This came out to be $33 billion, a very drastic amount which can be compared to today's $2.3 trillion. The country was thus forced into widespread inflation and resulting starvation. At one point, $1 was worth 1 trillion German marks, and citizens were better off burning the money than paying to buy coal for heat since it was cheaper to do so. The German economy took a harsh blow after blow until it was almost completely dismantled. With the country's economy and its people in tatters, the government was left in chaos and with no support from its peoples. Thirdly, disarmament is said to be a large part of the Treaty of Versailles, which resulted in World War II. Many military restrictions were set, such as Germany having to give up their submarines, tanks, air force, most ships and soldiers. They were also told to demilitarize certain areas. Thus, the world witnessed the fall of one of the strongest armies of history. The Allies felt that a smaller and poorer Germany was less of a threat to them at the time. However, they overlooked that with this clause, they were instilling a feeling of lack of security in German people. Germans had just witnessed the overturn of Russia under similar circumstances to those they were being forced into, and so feared that a weak military and government would mean new radicalized leaders would rise. The fourth major factor is said to be territorial losses. Germany's land and colonies were given to other countries, which added to their economic turmoil, since these lands were mostly used for industrial use. Therefore, since this income was no longer available to pay for reparations, the government had to tap into their gold reserves to make the payments, sending the economy into further depression. This clause, much like the GOAT clause, created embarrassment and resentment for the Allies, who were bluntly punishing the Central Powers. From the above description of the Treaty of Versailles, we can see that it severely crippled the German economy, which led to a weak government, and an almost inexistent German army left many afraid that Germany was feeling angry and cheated. The lack of support of Germany's new democracy paved way for Hitler's dictatorship, which encouraged safety for German people and promised things such as a living space. So now on to our final part, validity of opinion, my favorite for me to have prepared for this video. So in part 2, we explained why many people feel that the Treaty of Versailles caused World War II. However, there are also scholars in the world who do not agree with that. This opinion can be understood if we investigate past what is normally taught in schools. Now, to explain that last sentence, what is normally taught in schools, I'll diverge here for a minute, and I'd like to mention that everything I have spoken about up until part 3, so part 1 and 2, were ideas that I had learned about in school. So everything in part 3 were ones I had never been exposed to before I started researching for this video. I decided to start this project since I truly love learning about Canadian history, since it is what allows me to be a proud Canadian today. I especially love the grade 10 history course I took in school 2 years ago, for it showed me how Canada interacts with the rest of the world. However, the argument that the Treaty of Versailles was not a source of cause for World War II was never mentioned in that course, as far as I remember. Everything I've said until now, as I mentioned earlier, has been from my own previous knowledge, but from here on out, I'll be summarizing what I learned in a YouTube video that I've linked on the slide there at the bottom right. So first, we can argue that the feelings of sentiment that many carry for the post-World War I Germans, who are said to have been reprimanded too harshly. However, if we look at past treaties which the Germans themselves enforced on others, such as at the end of the Franco-Prussian War, we can see that they were just as, if not more harsh with the reparation costs. Furthermore, in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Russia, Germany took territories which were about 1/3 of its population, their best farmland, and about half of their industrial economy. Therein, we can see that the effect of how harsh the terms they asked for are far from what was compared to that which they received in the Treaty of Versailles. Which can be argued is that the Treaty of Versailles created leeway for the creation of Hitler. However, at that time period, the world has seen an increase in many other fascist leaders as well, such as Mussolini in Italy, Stalin in Soviet Union, Franco in Spain, and Tojo in Japan. Coincidence? Some believe not. Not all of them were brought forward by the Treaty of Versailles, clearly. Influences which could explain this we'll say quote coincidence in quotations, would be the widespread dissatisfaction in the world while people dealt with the Great Depression and the aftermath of the First World War, which left room for fascist leaders to come and convince them of a better life, convince their peoples in the country, tell them that they will fill up these holes that have been left after the war. Next, much like of military aggression which led up to the Second World War, can also be countered with examples of similar invasions happening in other parts of the world. Lastly, what I felt was the biggest reason to oppose the idea that the Treaty of Versailles caused World War II is that it wasn't the treaty, but rather the Allied leaders who did so. The treaty may have been able to hold back Hitler's radical ideologies if it had actually been enforced. There are many examples of the Allied leaders allowing appeasement of Hitler from his initial seat at the political table in the 6 years between 1933 to the beginning of the Second World War in 1939. For example, being in 1936 when Hitler reoccupied Rhineland and claimed it was to ensure his country's safety to the recent friendship of Russia and France, enemies on both sides. He could have been stopped right there and then by the Allied leaders. However, they themselves at the time were blinded by their own fears of communism. They even went as far as to call him a fighter of it in Germany and a leader who was instilling strong democracy. However, we now know that was clearly not the case. Therefore, although I had never thought of this point of view in the past, I now agree with the scholars who believe that the idea of the Treaty of Versailles causing World War II is one that is still being perpetuated after having been created by Hitler himself. as an excuse to make his way through Europe's political climate in the 1930s.